Everyone, my name is Dr. Philip Phillips. I'm the Associate Dean of the University Honors College. Dean John Weil and I welcome all of you here today. Most of you are here for the class, but we have some visitors. So if you're visiting today, welcome. This is not only a class, but it's a lecture series that is free and open to the public. Our theme this semester is letters. And today I'm very pleased to welcome speaker who knows something about letters in multiple languages, someone who is a longtime member of our honors faculty, and indeed someone who is one of our Buchanan faculty members. I think probably several of you in the audience have had her for a class and can attest to her brilliance and eloquence. And so we choose only the best to be faculty members here in the Honors College, and we're very selective about the people we invite to the lecture series. Joan McRae is professor of French in the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures here at Middle Tennessee State University. She earned her bachelor's degree from Agnes Scott College, her master's from Middlebury, and her doctorate from the University of Virginia. Her research interests encompass medieval manuscript and early book studies, medieval French poetry, Arthurian and Grail literature, French film, and detective fiction around the world. She's published books and articles on Alain Chartier, the Arthurian cycle, Dante, Christine de Pizan, among others. Her current project is a study of the literary quarrels of the Romance of the Rose and the Belle Dame sans Merci. Her topic today is What's Old is New Again, Lessons from Words of War, Peace, and Propaganda in 15th Century France. Please join me in welcoming Professor McRae. Thank you.
I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Phillips and to all of you for indulging me as I talk about some of my favorite subjects: France in the first quarter of the 15th century, Alain Chartier and King Charles the Sixth and the Seventh, and Joan of Arc. So if you'll just bear with me, hang with me, I hope you'll get some sort of interesting tidbits out of this talk. When in 1095, Pope Urban II called Christians in the Western realm to the defense of their Eastern brethren against the, quote, lawless and infidel Muslims, his speech persuaded thousands to stop their destructive infighting against each other, to take up the cause of righteousness and fight a just war. How in the world did the Pope convince European Christians to leave their homelands and journey far away to fight the infidels and capture the Holy Lands? It was with the power of words. Pope Urban, through his words, inspired a holy war. He was interested in driving the Muslims out of Europe, in liberating the holy city of Jerusalem from the rule of Muslims, and in reinforcing the power of the papacy in order to unite Christian Europe. With eloquent and persuasive rhetoric, he, in the name of St. Peter, authorized this holy war. By identifying the enemy and condemning their violence, he justified the war against the enemy and promised salvation for those who would join the fight. The First Crusade, as well as successive ones, focused on inspiring and launching a vigorous campaign for political, social, and religious change, a war supported by God and his emissaries on earth, and justified by the violence inflicted on Christians and their symbolic places. In the first quarter of the 15th century, France, too, was in need of its own kind of crusade, for she was imperiled by enemies, both without, by the English in the 100 Years' War, and within, through a civil war among the princes, especially the dastardly Duke of Burgundy. Many voices, including that of Alain Chartier, rose to the challenge to fight for the survival of France. Chartier launched his campaign, his verbal crusade, on behalf of his homeland, France, and the Dauphin Charles, the heir to the French throne. And here's an image of Dauphin. Doesn't he look like quite the character? You'll understand this, this portrait in a few minutes. This young prince was beleaguered by a country mired in civil war, by invasions from the English, and by crippling self-doubt. Chartier, like Pope Urban II, addressed his call to arms to a tripartite front: the church and university, the nobility, and the people. His weapon was writing, in Latin and French, poetry and prose. His aims were similar to those of Urban, mentioned above: to drive out the English enemy, to liberate the people and the sacred capital of Paris from the tyranny of the Duke of Burgundy, and to fight for the unification of the country under the Valois king. Chartier proclaimed that in defending France, Frenchmen could expiate their sins, sins which had provoked the hand of God against them, leading to this current state of crisis. As I said, and I'll reiterate, the situation in France was perilous. The madness, probably schizophrenia, of King Charles VI, first evident in August of 1392, left a power vacuum in the country, resulting in a constant renegotiation of power between the Dukes of Burgundy, Berry, Anjou, and Bourbon, and the king's brother, Louis of Orléans. And this is an image of when Charles VI lost his mind, attacked his own army, killing 4 or 5 of his own soldiers, almost killed his brother. But when the king's brother Louis was murdered by his envious and volatile cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, the country erupted into full-fledged civil war. The heirs of the murdered man, called the Orléanistes, or the Armagnacs, demanded retribution against the murderers, the Burgundians. Caught up in this fight was the household of the Duke of Anjou and his wife Yolande, whose daughter Marie was engaged to the third son of the king, also named Charles. Alain Chartier was employed early in his career by Queen Yolande and was appointed part of the secretarial team formed to serve the young Charles. But after the sudden deaths of his 2 older brothers, Charles became the newly entitled and unexpected Dauphin and heir to the French crown. And I don't know if you know, but the third son is typically trained to go into the church, not to become king. So Charles was completely unprepared to become Dauphin. Dauphin means heir to the throne. Alain Chartier accompanied the new Dauphin to Paris in 1417 to take up his new duties. He was with Charles in 1418 when the Burgundians ferociously invaded Paris, slaughtering their rivals, the Armagnacs, or anyone that they thought who might side with them. Charles and Alain were lucky to escape with their lives. Many other illustrious personages did not. Going into exile with the young Dauphin to the lands of the Loire Valley, Alain remained intensely loyal to Charles for the rest of his life, serving him in turn as secretary, notary, ambassador, author, poet, philosopher, theologian, and one of his most persuasive propagandists. Alain, reputed to have been quite ugly, according to the legend recounted by Jean Boucher, had a great talent with words. As the legend records, the Dauphiness Margaret of Scotland, whose marriage with the Dauphin, his own son, he arranged, found him as he was sleeping and kissed, quote, la précieuse bouche de laquelle sont ici et sortis tant de bons mots et de vertueuses paroles. And that's all the old French I'll quote for you. She kissed the precious mouth from which have come so many witty words and wise sayings. Alain, accepting of his limitations, but never of weakness, he brandished his pen as a sword. Through his words, he waged an insistent and effective war against the Dauphin's enemies, crusading in the Dauphin's name for the political, social, and religious survival of France. Chartier would use an assortment of tools to make his case and inspire action. To the people, the nobles, and the king, he sent many, many letters and composed treatises and poetry, including the quadrilogue Invective and the allegorical Book of Hope. Chartier strategized his approach as a crusading general should, targeting his audience quite deliberately by choosing the form and register most likely to influence them to join him in the fight for France. Like Urban, in an appeal to emotion, he first named the enemy, then justified the fight against the enemy by describing the violence perpetrated on the people. And finally, he made promises of unity and salvation for France and Frenchmen when the fight would be won. The letter-writing campaign of Chartier to rally the public to the Dauphin's defense began just after the Burgundian soldiers had taken control of Paris, the sacred capital of France. And this is an image of the invasion of Paris. You can see how the people are being massacred. Chartier, in the name of the Dauphin, was quick to identify in his letter and condemn the enemy, the Duke of Burgundy's men, who had committed treason, slaughtered the people like barbarians, kidnapped the king and the Dauphin's wife, Marie, and stolen the royal seals in order to deceive the people. In a letter from the king informing the citizens of Lyon of the invasion of Paris, for example, Chartier commented immediately on the treachery of the act. Quote, "By treason, some of the men of the Duke of Burgundy have entered into the town of Paris, in which they did many evil deeds, cruelties, and inhumanities, and through this invasion they have kidnapped the king, the mad king, and our dearly beloved companion the Dauphin, as well as the great seals of the king, with which they are sealing many letters written against the king's interests, as well as our own, in order to deceive you, the people, and other loyal subjects with the authority of these seals." In a second letter, Chartier expands his description of the violence of the enemy. The said rebels, disobedient and not content with having committed and perpetrated the evils, crimes, and acts of disobedience and cruelty above mentioned in a furious and disorderly manner, like people who do not know God and lack human pity, have betaken themselves to all the prisons in the said town, and there have inhumanely and cruelly killed and cut to pieces the constable, who was like the mayor of the town, and the chancellor, who is the head of the church of our Lord, many priests, bishops, knights, squires, and officers of our Lord, and other churchmen, prominent townspeople, and merchants, to a total of 3,000 people who were prisoners there, and they have butchered them like beasts. And then, taking no pity for the shedding of human blood, they have even killed, drowned, and put to death the wives and children of those above mentioned. And in that way they have sacked, destroyed, and laid waste this town, which is the capital of the realm, to which everyone should have recourse for justice. The description of the violence committed by the Duke of Burgundy's men is written to shock. The accumulation of words such as evil, crime, disobedience, cruelty, furious, disorderly, cut to pieces, butchered like beasts, sacked, destroyed, laid waste, all of these you can see, I've bolded them so that you can see the accumulation of these words of violence. It underscores the horror of what has happened in the massacre. The invocation of violence is strikingly similar to Urban's description of the violence of the infidels as recorded by Robert the monk. And here's an image of that first fight in the First Crusade. Here's the description of that encounter. From the confines of Jerusalem and the city of Constantinople, a horrible tale has gone forth, and very frequently has been brought to our ears, namely, that a race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, a generation, forsooth, which has not directed its heart and has not entrusted its spirit to God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by sword, pillage, and fire. It has led away a part of the captives into its own country, and a part it has destroyed by cruel tortures. When they wish to torture people by a base death, they perforate their navels, and dragging forth the extremity of the intestines, bind it to a stake. Then, with flogging, they lead the victim around until the viscera, having gushed forth, the victim falls prostrate upon the ground. I haven't heard a single ooh gross. Others they bind to a post and pierce with arrows. Others they compel to extend their necks, and then, attacking them with naked swords, attempt to cut through the neck in a single blow. What shall I say of the rapes of the women? To speak of it is worse than to be silent. The kingdom of the Greeks is now dismembered by them and deprived of territory, so vast and extent that it cannot be traversed in a march of 2 months. The similarity of the two passages is striking in the use of violence as a tool to evoke emotion in the cause of persuasion. Urban emphasizes that the infidels are traitors to God. They behave like vicious beasts to their fellow man. War against them is thus necessary and justified. Chartier, too, by calling out the treason, barbarisms, and thefts of John the Fearless against the throne, is able to justify the Dauphin's war against the Burgundians, they who have captured the mad king and have taken control of the government. Chartier expresses his outrage, shock, and horror as he shares the detail he's learned. He uses the language of emotion, highly charged, repetitive, replete with a profusion of adjectives that convey the cruelty and brutality of the event and its perpetrators. 8 letters survive from Chartier's first energetic letter campaign, dated from 1418 to 1419, which was undertaken to warn the people of the towns and countryside of the treachery of the Duke of Burgundy. Alain hoped to win the hearts and minds of loyal Frenchmen, to rally public opinion to the Dauphin's cause, to justify waging war against the Duke of Burgundy, that tyrant, and his co-conspirators, the English invaders. Though only these few letters survive today, multiple copies must have blanketed the realm, sent to towns and royal officers, both loyal to the Dauphin and those uncertain or undeclared. For it was essential to spread the word, to warn the people, to rouse support. Notations at the end of these letters indicate how the message was spread throughout a region. It says at the bottom, "And so that no one can claim ignorance, let these letters be published everywhere possible," followed by additional notation, "published in Troyes in the customary places, published in Chalons on the day of God's feast, published in Charolles before Monseigneur, the bailiff of Charolois, published in Langres by the town crier to the sound of the trumpet," etc. And so this is the way they have kept records of how the information was disseminated. Likewise, Urban II urged his listeners to spread the word. This is how the momentum for a first crusade would be built. Quote, "You, brothers and fellow bishops, you, fellow priests, and sharers with us in Christ, make this same announcement through the churches committed to you, and with your whole soul vigorously preach the journey to Jerusalem." That's from the version of Baldric of Dole. War was justified, according to both Urban and Chartier, to defend the cause. However, the cause must beware of conflict that might cripple it. This weakness was caused by those reprehensible sins of the people, exhortations of shame and guilt for the human sin that allowed, even provoked, such violence, was also expressed in the highly charged emotional words of both Chartier and the Pope. Urban contended that his profound grief at the suffering of their Christian brothers fulfills the prophecy of the Psalms. Moreover, the shame of the current state of crisis, he claims, is untenable. Forgiveness is urgent. Sin and shame, the need for forgiveness, became further justification to take action. That forgiveness can be earned through taking up arms to defend and relieve the suffering of brother Christians. Quote, more suffering of our brethren and devastation of churches remains than we can speak of, one by one, for we are oppressed by tears and groans, sighs and sobs. We weep and wail, brethren, alas, like the psalmist in our inmost heart. We are wretched and unhappy, and in us is that prophecy fulfilled. God, the nations are come unto thine inheritance. Thy holy temple they have defiled. They have laid Jerusalem in heaps. The dead bodies of thy servants have been given to be food for the birds of heaven, the flesh of thy saints unto the beasts of the earth. Their blood have they shed like water round Jerusalem, and there are none to bury them. Woe unto us, brethren, we who have already become a reproach to our neighbors, a scoffing, a derision to them round about us. Let us at least with tears condone and have compassion upon our brothers. We who are become the scorn of all peoples, and worse than all, let us bewail the monstrous devastation of the Holy Land. Notice again the semantic field built of these highly charged emotional words to evoke empathy. Suffering, tears, groans, sighs, sobs, weep, wail, woe, reproach, condone, compassion, scorn, bewail, devastation. The accumulation of these emotional words creates quite a persuasive force. Chartier's exhortation to crusade for the French throne follows those same themes of sin and shame in his ultimate message to the people of France, the nobles, and the church. His quadrilogue invective, that is, the four-sided debate, is a masterpiece of lyric prose and propaganda that addresses the whole of France and her need for redemption. The text is a dream vision in which the author observes a conversation between Lady France, who you see pictured there weeping, and her three children, the knight, who is in his knightly garb, the clergy, who is in red, and the people, who has fallen out on the ground because he's so exhausted. They fight amongst themselves about who is to blame for the current state of calamity in France. Chartier reveals his answer in the introduction. The blame comes from the sin and shame of their country's current condition, incapable of preventing the invasions of the English and compromised by the collusion of the Burgundians with the English. In the text's conclusion, Chartier will offer remedy and salvation, unity of the nobles, the clergy, and the people for the promotion of the common good of France. In this introductory passage, Chartier points out the shame of their current situation. Since in the year 1422, I have seen the English king, long-time adversary of this realm, flattering himself for inflicting on us the reprehensible shame, enriching himself with the spoils of our defeat, scorning our actions and our courage, encouraging our own people in treason with his alliances. Since I've seen our sins augment over the years and our blind passions adding relentlessly to our confusion, I've concluded in my mind that the hand of God is on us and that his fury has set in motion this scourge of persecution. I searched avidly in the scriptures the sins and punishments of our fathers and ancestors, and gripped by a terrible fear, I asked myself if this painful adversity is the rod of the Father used for our correction, or the severity of a judge for our extermination. Among other writings, I read the 3rd chapter of Isaiah. My heart trembled with fear, my eyes clouded with tears. I saw in the blows we have suffered so many signs of death and indications of divine anger if we do not seek prompt remedy. Again, the accretion of negatively charged words to create a semantic field of desperation. You can see the profusion of bolded words here in the slide. Again, the percentage of the bolded words compared to the regular text really gives you an idea of that accumulation of these highly charged words. Like Urban before him, Choutier finds correspondence in the scriptures to bring attention to the gravity of their situation, caused by their own sins against God. By defeating their enemies, they can expiate their sins. He thus justifies his call to unify the country through the war against the English. Only through unification can they achieve salvation. As in the Pope's speech, the guilt of sin and the promise for expiation is used as a tool of persuasion. Choutier's Lady France urges the three estates to stop blaming each other, to repent, to unite. Quote, "I no longer wish to hear your excuses," she says, "your recriminations against each other, for it is not through your disagreements and your attempts at exoneration that we will recover. Instead, each should seek to amend his own ways and stop vilifying the other. The love of the public good can outshine your personal complaints if individual wills unite in a single desire for the salvation of all." The quadrilogue was written in 1422 in reaction to the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420. In this treaty, the Mad King of France, under the influence of the Duke of Burgundy, reinforced by the might of the Duke of Burgundy's armies, as well as those of England, had signed a pact to disinherit his only son in favor of the King of England, Henry V, to whom he had married a daughter. But France does not allow inheritance through a daughter. So basically what the treaty did is merge the two countries upon the deaths of King Charles VI. The Dauphin Charles was exiled from the court. He would have to fight for his legitimacy to inherit the throne and prevent France from becoming English. The Dauphin, I said that, King Charles's disinheritance and refusal to forgive the disastrous actions of what happened on the bridge of Montereau, in which, spoiler alert, John, the Duke of Burgundy, is murdered, was ironic because John had murdered the king's own brother just 12 years earlier. Indeed, it was that murder that had started the Civil War to begin with. John, however, had been pardoned by the king thanks to a clever justification presented on his behalf by Jean Petit. He had presented this argument to the king and the king's council. This is an image that shows Louis of Orleans, the king's own brother, slaughtered in a back alley of Paris. This is a copy of the justification. In his justification, it was claimed that John, in killing the king's brother, who was, as you've already figured out, his main rival for power, had not committed homicide, but tyrannicide, that is, the killing of a tyrant. Louis, John explained in his justification, had tried on numerous occasions and by several methods to kill the mad king. He had used poisons and intoxications and witchcraft. He had even set him afire, a reference to the infamous Bal des Ardents, in which the courtiers, including the king, dressed up as wild men, and then they were accidentally caught on fire. Moreover, John claimed that Louis was directly responsible for the king's illness, which he had inflicted on him through sorcery. Quote, "The dead criminal Duke of Orleans performed invocations of devils, superstitions, charms, exhortations, spells, and all sorts of evil." John Petit, to prove his points, cited witnesses and listed occasions on which Louis had made use of black magic by summoning the devil, using charms and ultimately resorting to poison to try and achieve his goal of killing the king. Most appallingly, Louis had also tried to kill the Dauphin, the king's son, with a poisoned apple, and inadvertently had killed his own son. And so all of that he had done so that he could take the throne for himself. John justified the murder by highlighting the greater violence and inhumanity of his enemy and his victim, whom he called a tyrant. The King's Council, unable to act against such a powerful duke with his large army and popularity with the people, could not go against the whims of an insane king. They acquiesced to the king's pardon. But clearly, something fishy was going on. How had this happened? The Dauphin's rival, the Duke of Burgundy, was a powerful propagandist in his own right. From him, Chartier had learned effective propaganda techniques. Burgundy, too, identified the enemy, dehumanized him, and then promised his version of salvation. His rhetoric was directed at the people because he recognized the power of their support, even if his claim was illegitimate, because he was just a mere cousin to the king. Burgundy's political campaign to gain power had begun some years earlier. Through a prolific letter campaign, he spread rumors about his adversary, that he practiced sorcery, mismanaged the crowd's money, and was sexually immoral. While he hailed himself as the protector of the Mad King and the savior of the country. His propaganda campaign to influence the king and the people was constructed on the same pattern as Pope Urban's crusade speech. First, identify your enemy. Second, vilify them. And third, promise salvation. John had a series of enemies over the course of time: the king's brother, the king's wife, and now the king's heir to the throne. The first enemy he murdered, the second enemy he vilified and then seduced, and the third enemy, the Dauphin Charles, escaped his grasp in Paris, but he exiled him. Only 15, the Dauphin was a feeble match for Burgundy. Burgundy's identification of the enemy and his justification of war against them was firmly ensconced in his argument to claim political power. He was justified to take power, he claimed, because he was the good prince, loyal to the king and interested in the bien public, the common good. He backed up his claims with a large army of 4,000 to 6,000 soldiers at any given time. His promises of salvation touched purse and soul. His reform proposals were distributed throughout the kingdom in a vigorous letter campaign proposing taxation relief and fiscal responsibility. The proposals were very precise in listing all the problems of the French realm, which needed repair, but his solutions were misleading, dependent on a manipulation of truth. One specific problem he highlighted was that the war with the English continued only because, quote, no one had provided a satisfactory solution, as though a solution should be easy enough to achieve, should those in government be willing. His accusations implied that the other side was uninterested in ending the war with the English, when in fact he was the one who was uninterested in ending the war with the English because he made so much money trading with the English. He claimed that the war tax was serving not to fund the war, but to enrich the royal court's insatiable appetites for luxury and decadence. For example, in 1416, after the issuance of a newly ordered royal tax to support the war effort, John sent letters to all the affected towns not to pay the tax, promising that he would defend their right to refuse to pay it. Well, towns such as Carcassonne were happy to obey the Duke, who lightened their fiscal debt, and this was just one of the many effective means of currying favor with the public. Because of the lack of good leadership, Burgundy claimed, the war with the English continued on and on. Each time the English attacked the coast, many valiant men and merchants, and others were destroyed and disinherited. Burgundy's many letters and manifestos sent throughout the country highlighted the economic uncertainty the war was causing, providing yet another concrete example of how the common good was compromised by the rule of his rivals, linking taxes and war and painting to the devastation that trade and commerce suffered as a result. Burgundy was able to agitate the people, especially the merchant class. When his disinformation, or black propaganda, we call it, Burgundy's strategy was to deepen the imagined disparity between his people, who were the loyal subjects of the king, and the treasonous enemies who did not support him. The political discord between aristocratic factions, the Armagnacs, who supported the Dauphin, and the Burgundians, who allied with the English, infected and inflamed the common people. As a contemporary chronicler described it, quote, "In villages and cities, all royal subjects, moved by the spirit of sedition and divided into Armagnac and Burgundian, were in open war and called on another cursed traitors. The terms Burgundian and Armagnac were used as provocative insults. People wore badges on their lapels and hats to identify visibly their adherence to party, further dividing the populace, of course. Burgundy took advantage of the political climate in France. The people were exhausted by war and the seemingly unrelenting taxes raised for the realm's defense. The French countryside was suffering famine and physical devastation. The town's markets could barely continue the trade that fed the people. Burgundy promised them provisions to sell and the freedom to sell them. He promised good government. He promised to end the war. He claimed that only he could solve their problems. It is little wonder, then, that the common people were taken in by someone who promised to champion their cause, to bring them salvation. But Burgundy's reforms came to naught. Not a single reform was implemented, even when Burgundy managed to take control over the king and the government between 1409 and 1413, and again after 1418, except one reform. In 1409 and again in 1418, he established a commission of general reformers to eradicate the bad weeds growing in the government's garden, or in today's parlance, to drain the swamp. Accordingly, the Burgundians fined, decommissioned, arrested, or executed anyone associated with their rivals. The royal mandate authorized Burgundy to arrest anyone he and his men thought was harming the realm, and he could claim that all of his decisions and acts were directed towards ensuring the common good and ordered by the king. He used his position not to relieve the suffering of the people, but to consolidate his power by eliminating his enemies. Then, to convince any not yet convinced, he had his rivals excommunicated by the church. Partisans of Burgundy did not use the normal sign of the cross like this, but instead would make the sign of St. Andrew. I don't know if you can see the St. Andrew's cross here in the form of an X. He held parades in towns across the realm to celebrate his victories over his rivals and to flaunt his military power and prestige. But in 1419, Burgundy himself was murdered by the Dauphin Charles's men. Just as Jean Petit had justified John the Fearless 10 years earlier, Alain Chartier was charged with justifying the murder of John the Fearless in letters addressed to the heir of Burgundy, to his wife, and all the cities of the realm. 7 of these letters, varying in presentation but essentially the same in content, have survived. I think at this point you may be able to guess the structure of his defense. First, he recalls for his audience the abuses of Burgundy, his past collusion with the King of England, the slaughter in Paris, the capture of the Mad King, the exile of the king's son from the capital. Despite these barbaric and traitorous actions, the Dauphin, the only son and heir of the king, regent of the realm, was willing to forgive Burgundy and his men. In May of 1419, Alain recalls in his letters, the Dauphin and Burgundy signed a peace treaty, agreeing to halt all internal aggressions and to join forces against England. These agreements the Duke of Burgundy swore to by his body and faith, by proclamation and letters marked with his own seal, signed with his own hand. And yet, Chartier reveals, the said Duke last month met with the damnable English in Calais, and the French always refer to the English as the goddams, to sign new treaties against the Dauphin, to plan how to capture the Dauphin and disinherit him, and how to renew attacks against the people of France. Promises of money, gifts, and the highest offices in the land sweetened these treacherous treaties. We have proof of this treachery, Chartier continues, because we have captured copies of the signed letters and have confessions of witnesses to the meetings between the English and the Duke. Having thus vilified the defunct Duke, Chartier continues with a rendition of the encounter on the bridge. Despite the lies and renewed treachery of the Duke, the Dauphin agreed to meet with him in Montreux, but the Dauphin, the regent, that is the acting ruler of France, and his men were kept waiting for 18 days, a move designed to prove that the Duke had the Dauphin in his hands. The Dauphin was overly accommodating, offering even the chateau to the Duke and his men to stay in. However, the Dauphin was secretly warned that there was a plan afoot to do him harm. When the two sides met on the bridge, despite overtures of welcome, the Duke's men made it clear that they intended to kidnap the Dauphin. When one of the Duke's men raised his sword in a threat, all chaos broke out. Quote, in such a fashion that in the conflict of our servants and his, he lay dead on the bridge. Notice the lack of agency, the passive voice used here. Chartier concludes the letter with reassurances to the people that the Dauphin is fine. He reminds them of the Dauphin's fervent wish for peace, his love for his subjects, including the House of Burgundy. He promises salvation for those who will join him to fight against the English enemy. Chartier adds an additional factor to this pattern, and that is the promise of love and forgiveness that the Dauphin offers to any and everyone. The letters justifying the Dauphin were published widely throughout the land, but the Dauphin, exiled from Paris and from proximity to the king, was not near enough to persuade his father or mother of his side of the story. Burgundy's men and the English held the mad king captive, hence the Treaty of Troyes to disinherit the Dauphin, a conspiracy hatched well before John the Fearless was murdered. This is a copy of that treaty with the king's seal down below, the ones that had been stolen by the Duke of Burgundy. The irony is that it was the Duke of Burgundy's own death that would serve as the purported justification for the Dauphin's disinheritance. The problem ultimately for Burgundy, John and his son Philippe, who followed him, was that his war, a civil war, could not be successfully maintained as a crusade. The people were still unflagging in their support of the king, mad though he was. He was called Charles the Well-Loved. He had once been handsome, gallant, and brave. They didn't like the Treaty of Troyes that would give the country to the English king because, after all, the English were even worse to them than their own king. Burgundy had provided neither peace nor prosperity. The reforms and salvation promised by Burgundy never materialized, and the continuing internal conflict was untenable. Frenchmen were fighting against their own family members, against their own countrymen, while the English enriched themselves with plunder. The powerful propaganda that had propelled Burgundy to power was just a collage of empty words and false promises. The hate it was based on, while an effective emotional tool, was not sustainable in the long run. The King of England died in August of 1422. Would this negate the treaty? Well, 6 weeks later, the King of France died before the issue could be decided. The only child of Henry V was 9 months old, but he had older uncles eager for power. Now was the time for the Dauphin Charles, whose claim to the French throne was actually much stronger, to act. But however forceful was Alain Chartier's crusade of letters to promote the Dauphin's claim to the throne, the Dauphin himself was timid and unsure of how to proceed. Dissatisfaction and despair draped the country in a cloak of despondency. Chartier would allegorize the despondency in his last major work, The Book of Hope, in which the author, beset by the three personifications of mistrust, wrath, and despair, wishes to commit suicide, until a small window opens, giving entrance to faith and hope. In the spring of 1429, a ray of hope appeared before Charles, an unlikely savior of the king and the people. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was inspired by her voices from God. She was ushered into Dauphin Charles' court at Chinon, and after being tested by his counselors, the timid king called her before him. Chartier described the encounter. Quote, he commanded that she be summoned in front of him and listened carefully to her speech. No one knows what she said. Nevertheless, it is very obvious that the king was indeed filled with no small joy, as if restored by hope. Something was said that convinced Charles that he was the true king of France, something that convinced him to fight for the throne, something that inspired him to win. Joan led the French armies to miraculous victory over the English in Orléans, and then she led Charles to be crowned king at the cathedral in Reims. Chartier's last letter, his last recorded words written in July of 1429, were to praise this maiden. He described in his letter the remarkable feats she had already accomplished and the hope she was inspiring. An unlikely hero, she had inspired the French troops to fight for France, for the French dynasty. In his letter to an unknown foreign prince, he described her success and her influence. Quote, she came not from a place on earth, but was sent from heaven. She seems to sustain all France on her head and shoulders. She led the king ashore to harbor as he struggled in the vast sea with tempests and hurricanes. She raised his spirit to hope for better times. Suppressing English ferocity, she stirred the French courage, saved the French from ruin, and ignited the French flame. O singular virgin, worthy of all glory and praise, worthy of divine honors, you, pride of the kingdom, you, lamp, you, light, you are the pride of the French and of all true Christians. I'll finish up here. Weapons are powerful, but as we know, the pen can be mightier than the sword. In 15th century France, the use of propaganda lit the fires of civil war, disseminating hatred and violence. But ultimately, the force of words, hopeful words, saved the kingdom. Not just those diplomatic letters of Alain Chartier, but also the whisper of Joan of Arc in the ear of an uncertain king. For without her, France might not have survived the 100 Years' War against the English. And for that matter, without French support 300 years later, the United States might not have won its freedom from England. Thank you all so much for your patience.
Thank you. We have any questions or comments?
Yes, ma'am.
In all of these letters that you showed us, there was just such a masterful use of language to provoke people with the response that they wanted. Yeah. Was this just kind of the work of brilliant minds, or was this because those people, as aristocracy and nobles, maybe had the opportunity to study the rhetorical devices of Aristotle or stuff like that, where they had the opportunity to practice the skill of persuading people?
I think that training has certainly had a good influence, and Chartier is called the father of French eloquence, so he is definitely a supreme example of the power of the written word. Urban II as well has for generations been praised for his power of persuasion. But I would suggest to you that this strategy of convincing people through vilifying the enemy with descriptions of their violence is not a thing of the past. And I can also tell you that modern scholars of propaganda and of war rhetoric find this same pattern in modern calls for war. I don't know if that answers your question. I've lulled you all into a sleep.
I'm just curious with respect to rhetoric, do you think that rhetoric should be taught like in a general curriculum so people can see that when they're faced with it, or do you think that would make the problem worse?
I see your point. I think that forearmed is forewarned. So I would, I'm glad you caught my point, which is that rhetoric is still important. And you need to understand the techniques of rhetoric so that you're not taken in. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now that a lot of the times that we receive this rhetoric as opposed to through letters is through media, and specifically digital media, what role do you think that like media literacy plays in forewarning people about the power of propaganda?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have to be careful. News travels so quickly now. Twitter seems to be the new method of dissemination of information really quickly. It's sort of taken the place of those letter campaigns that used to blanket the country in the first quarter of the 15th century. I think we've all seen how inflammatory things like Twitter can be, even Facebook. And we need to recognize that that's part of the strategy to get you emotional and get you to join the cause. Now, but one thing that we see missing from that is the last part, which is the promise of salvation. So if you want to see a really effective strategy, you've got to watch for that last part. See what promises are being made. Didn't y'all love these pictures? Yes. I had so much fun finding those.
I actually have a question about the picture. Yeah. Is this a period piece of artwork, or is this one of modern edition?
Oh yeah, this one is from the late 15th century, so this is an after the fact.
I couldn't help but notice the scale of her hand. And the man with his head on backwards is when you really distracting.
Oh yeah, he's quite turned around, isn't he? Yeah, it's not until the 16th century that we start seeing more accurate depictions. This hand up right here is a signal that she's talking. And so that's why it's so large.
Her finger is as long as her
And that means she's going to teach. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so hands are really important as symbols within the iconography. Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, I can't explain why his elbow's on backwards. I just think it's just bad art. And then this one is from a manuscript that was done in the 1450s, maybe 1455. And at this point, Charles VII has gained control of the country, and they've kicked the kings out. They've kicked the English out. The Wars of the Roses are about to start over in England, which helps the French a lot. But this is interesting. The artist has changed the text in his interpretation, and instead of having a crumbling chateau of France, it's all perfectly manicured. And her robes should be torn according to the text, but she's perfectly coiffed. Why? Because the country's in order. So you can tell I like the pictures too. Yeah, but this was about letters, not pictures. So I talked about the letters. And the letter that I showed you is really one of the letters. That's the seal of the Dauphin. Dauphin means dolphin in French. And so see the little, can you see the teeth on the dolphin there in his seal? Very cool, I thought. And I love these badges too, that we still have, that the people wore.
This was a French culture question, but why did they call the Air the Dauphin?
Because the main tract of land that he inherits is down here, and it's called the Dauphinois. So the Dauphin. Dolphin, hence the dolphin on the seals.
All right, we are out of time.
Sorry.
Thank you again.